Welcome to another episode of Lifestyle Business
with Chris and Ann. We're switching it up a little bit.
We are switching it up a little bit.
It's great to be here today, and we have a fantastic show. It's actually a very special episode. We are hosting Mitch Landrieu, the former Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana and former Mayor of New Orleans, and he's going to join us in a talk about his thoughts on how we can move forward as a nation during these unprecedented times, and how his organization, E Pluribus Unum, is working to fulfill America's promise of justice and opportunity for all, breaking down the barriers that divide us by race and class. And before we get started there, it's great to have you all back. We took the week off last week for a little bit of a break.
We did.
Which was nice. It was a good chance for us to recap, recalibrate, and think about what the summer season of Lifestyle Business is going to look like.
Doing 2 shows a week, you sort of realize why the Daily Show and all these shows take holiday weeks off, don't you?
Yeah, and how nice it would be to have a staff like they do. But nonetheless, yeah, we were really nice to reflect, and it was a great time for us to catch up. And just as a recap for the spring season, what we focused on was obviously how small businesses are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Wow, after last week, that feels like a long time ago, even though we're still in the middle of it. A lot of the things that we did were, resources, education, training, support for folks getting PPP loans, getting access to banks, and all kinds of things like that. And we did have a highlight we wanted to share with. We had a few folks reach out to us and let us know that they've been successful.
I mean, you've gotten some personal handwritten notes.
I did get a personal handwritten note that this was a good thing. So that's why I'm going to keep doing it.
Which is great. But, things are starting to move, and we're going to move into today's topic, which is a gear shift, but starting to move on the small business front. One of the members of Launchpad Nation let us know last night, as a matter of fact, that he just received a $150,000 EIDL loan, and he learned about the program from this show and applied, as we encourage people to do. And we're hearing more and more stories about that. So hopefully we're doing a little bit of good here for the Launchpad community and beyond.
Anyway, I think shifting gears to summer, we're delighted to have Mitch on today. I mean, talk about a great get, and we've got some exciting shows coming up. We've got Mark L'Oreal, Mayor Tubbs from Stockton, California, and a lot more coming up in the following weeks. But this show is pretty timely. While we were off, I mean, obviously we could not avoid watching our nation unfold in its current crisis last week. And I think, everyone being touched by it and everyone playing a role. So we're delighted because I think Mitch has been one of the loudest voices on trying to solve these systemic issues around race here in the country. But I did want to just briefly, before we bring Mitch on, just talk a little bit about what we did today.
We hosted a conversation. This we did not broadcast, but with our Launchpad members in the Launchpad community, and had an incredible conversation. Also, kind of intense. And I think we're got a question for Mayor Landrieu on the topic of the intensity. But I think important conversations that we're having right now. And I think we just wanted to highlight some of the things that we were hearing from African American members of our community. One of the things this is our reality. This is our reality that we live every day, was one of the quotes. But now you are starting to pay attention. I thought was, sort of an interesting.
Super interesting.
Yeah. And
I also thought something that kept resonating for us, we had a good conversation around how you have to educate your kids if you're a Black parent, around where they can run, who they can hang out with, whether they're in a car and they're deciding to speed. And I think it was a very important conversation, because I think a lot of us in a position of privilege don't worry if a police officer ends up behind our car, and don't have to educate our kids around what it's like to only have one chance to make a mistake, and sometimes not even that chance. And so I think one of the things we heard loud and clear from the community was keep having conversations, do the work. Don't broadcast that you're doing the work, just do the work, learn, have those conversations, and shine a light on the fact that it is a different experience for people. And, you know, it's very humanizing to think about that. And one of the members of our team, she gave me a really good insight after the call. She said, I think the work needs to be done not just by Black parents to educate their Black children about the challenges that they face in these times in general, but actually for white folks to talk to white kids about that and not make the burden actually have to be carried only by Black families. And I thought that was a really powerful message, which is we all need to play a role. And if we're going to change these systemic issues, we all actually have to carry the burden. So that was interesting. And I think now it's time, let's just pop into bring Mayor Landrieu on, because obviously he has a lot more insight and intelligence to share on this particular topic.
So Mayor Landrieu, I'm going to bring you in now while Anne introduces you.
Great. And now he was the 61st mayor of New Orleans, taking office as the city was still recovering from Hurricane Katrina in the midst of the BP oil spill. Under his leadership, New Orleans is widely recognized as one of the nation's greatest comeback stories. He's spent his life dedicated to public service, winning recognition for his governing abilities and gaining national prominence for his powerful decision to take down 4 Confederate monuments in New Orleans. It also earned him the prestigious John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award. To talk to us more about the work he's doing as the founder and president of the Unum Fund around the issues of race, equity, economic opportunity, and violence, please welcome Mitch Landrieu. Mitch, it's great to see you.
Hey, you guys, thank you so much for having me. You have a treat coming to you if you're talking to Mark Morial, who, as you know, was the mayor of the city of New Orleans a couple years before I was, and was a great mayor, and is the head of the Urban League and knows as much about this and business as anybody in the country. And then Michael Tubbs, one of the youngest mayors from the West Coast. He's going to be great. I'm happy to be with all of you today, and I'd like to thank my friend Scott Shallett, who worked with me since I was in politics, and is a great guy who I owe a lot of my political career to, and I know all of you guys know him, and I'm thrilled to be with Launchpad. I'm really pumped up that Launchpad is a New Orleans thing that has been moving all over the country, just kind of showing people what it's like to do it what we say the New Orleans way, because there is so much to do, especially with small businesses, entrepreneurs. The entire ecosystem of creating wealth through finding new ideas to solve old problems. It's all spectacular. You have a lot of work to do. Everybody needs access to capital. Everybody's got to have good ideas. Everybody needs to have the freedom to fail. It's okay to fail. If you're not failing, you're not creating. All of those things are critically important, and I don't need to preach to you about them. However, I will say this, that the last couple of months should remind you about something that you should have been taught early in your life, which is you're not nearly in control as much as you think you are. And that there are historical trends, national trends, massive events that occur in our lives, whether they be hurricanes or pandemics, that you have to kind of get ready for. And building up resilience, personal resilience, financial resilience, spiritual resilience, all of those things are important so that when bad things come our way, and we know that they will, we have to be ready to respond to them. The 2008 financial crisis was one of those things where we figured out that we weren't really as resilient as we thought we would be. We have to think about decisions that should have been made a long time ago that we didn't, that would have put us in a better situation. But there are certain issues that permeate almost everything that we do all of the time. And race is one of them in America. It's one of the things that we ignore. We go around it. You know, we are called to it from time to time because there is a bad event, and then we focus on it, and then we forget about it, as though somehow it doesn't have anything to do with us. But we are in a particularly dark moment in the history of our country. I'm 60 years old. Probably most of you on this call are probably a bit younger than me. I can't remember really any other time like this in my life. The closest that I can recall that I have been talked out of in the last couple of days is 1968, when within that a very short period of time, we lost John F. Kennedy, we lost Dr. King, we lost Robert Kennedy, we had the Vietnam War, the streets were, strewn with protesters. But if you think about it, this is actually worse. And I actually happen to think it's much worse. And people that lived during that period of time who were there on the streets have confirmed that although that was terrible, it wasn't quite as deep and as widespread as we're facing right now. Now, I tell you that not to scare you. I happen to think that we can work our way through any problem that we have, that really that's just a matter of willpower and vision and passion and making good decisions. But for some reason in America, we have taken a break from being able to do just that. I don't know why that's so. The question that I think is the most important question we can ask is how in the heck did we lose the first 2 decades of the 21st century with all of America's might and her capability and the ability to do the great things that America has done? How did we find a way to fight with each other for 2 decades when we should have paced the rest of the world? There are a lot of reasons for that, and there are answers to the questions about why that is. But one of the issues that has been with us since the beginning of time has been race. And the African American community has said this to us time and time and time again, and particularly white people are deaf to these calls, or we are ignorant in the sense of unknowing in the sense of not well taught, are taught improperly, not really fully understanding our whole history, or because we live in certain places, we work with certain people, we don't have a close connection to individuals that don't look like us, don't act like us, don't pray like us, and consequently don't experience the same things that they experience. On top of that, we are not want to admit when we haven't done very well. And so race is an issue that we don't really know how to talk about. I wouldn't be embarrassed by this. This is a really tough conversation, and we have not in this country really confronted the issue and gone through the issue. We go around it, we go over it, we go under it, but we never deal with it until something like the killing of George Floyd takes place. Now, I say this with deep sacredness because he's actually being laid to rest as we speak. So God rest his soul, and my prayers and thoughts are with his family. And of course, his parents and his brothers and sisters and his kids. And of course, all of his friends. But, some white people might sit back and go, yeah, it was terrible what happened, but why did the entire nation explode? Well, that's an easy question to answer if you're an African American. And if you talk to individuals who share with you and feel comfortable sharing with you, it's because they're tired and they're sick and they've had enough. This goes on and on and on, whether you are talking about Ahmaud Arbery or you're talking about all of the people. Just keep going back, and you can go all the way back just in our short lives to Louima in 1997 in New York, who police beat on the street and sodomized with a stick, who don't get fair justice and who are not treated the same way, who don't get the benefit of the doubt that white people get. And I'm just talking about in the criminal justice system right now, not the healthcare delivery system, not the economic system, not all of the other systems, which is something that is worth talking about. And I can tell you from talking to a lot of people in this past week, if you're listening, if you're a white person and you're listening and you're trying to hear and you're trying to understand, if you don't, first of all, thank you for trying to. But secondly, there are some incidences that touch a nerve that is so deep and that is so true and that is so generally reflective that the entire nation has to stand up and say, okay, we have to stop on this. And that is what happened just this past week. Every African-American person that I know actually could see themselves in the face of this fantastic man whose life was taken inexplicably and unnecessarily and wrongly, and symbolically felt like that is what their life was like. No matter what they did, no matter how good they were, the nation's knee was on their neck. And that is what this nation is experiencing right now. And we are being called into a moment where we don't just want to make sure that there is justice, but we have to change, not just and recompense, not just for that act, but we have to think about the institutions and the laws and the cultural behaviors and the patterns that produced the ability for that to happen without having a friend or a peer step in to stop it. And that's just about criminal justice reform. And so as you think about race just from that perspective, and then you bring it out a little bit further, what you will find out, and this is what my team found out, E Pluribus Unum Fund is the name of our organization. We traveled the South for the last 14 months. We started in the South because this is where I'm from. And I wanted to really understand where Southern folks were, both white and African-American, rich and poor, urban and rural. We interviewed over 1,000 people. We went to 33 counties. We went to 13 states. We did interviews that lasted half hour, 45 minutes, an hour, depending on how long people wanted to talk to us. And we're asking people about their feelings about this. And of course, we got different stories depending on who we talked to. If we talked to white people, not all of them, but many of them who responded didn't understand institutional racism. They think that racism is a thing of the past. They think that slavery was a long time ago. They don't think there's any sequela from that to today. They believe that everybody has equal opportunity, and that the reason why people don't get where they get is because they don't work hard enough. That's essentially what their view is. It's not all, I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close. African Americans, on the other hand, say, you know what, we're not just talking about individual acts of malice, being looked at the wrong way when we go down the street, being called a bad name, being cursed at, not being given the benefit of the doubt. What we're talking about is institutional bias, redlining, the inability to get a loan because we happen to look the way we look and live in the wrong neighborhood, lack of access to capital, so that we cannot build generational wealth, the way the criminal justice system actually affects our kids. Now, if you've ever talked to a Black parent or African-American friend, and you talk to them and ask them how they feel when they're walking down the street, or if they're driving a car and a police car pulls up behind them, if you ever ask them what kind of conversations they have with their young, particularly sons, it will break most of you down to your knees, because these are not the kinds of things that we as white people normally have to think about. We are not forced by our society to wear our whiteness. Almost every African American that I know, rich or poor, folks in the country that I grew up with, or folks in the inner city that I play ball with, folks that I work with, not one of them will say to me anything other than they're forced to wear their Blackness all the time and made aware of it. And they're completely and totally conscious of it. And they feel very sincerely that there is an institutional bias against them that we can then go through and actually look at. On the broader scale, this has to do with access to voting. It has access to do with how we draw legislative districts that creates the ability to elect people that represent our interest. It has access, as I said, to jobs and opportunity, access to good schools because of how school districts are drawn. And essentially what we found in our work, and we stand by it, and you can read it in a report called dividedbydesign.org, is that our nation is the way it is because we designed it this way. It was designed this way either unintentionally by benign neglect, and in some instances, it was actually done overtly. As a matter of fact, as we speak, a number of different Confederate monuments are being taken down across the country, the most prominent of which is Robert E. Lee's statue in Richmond, Virginia. And there's a story in the paper today about it, is when that statue was put up, the reason it was put up was it was going to become the center of a housing neighborhood that was being built. And there were actually covenants in the rules and regulations that prohibited the individuals who were developing that subdivision from selling to African Americans. If you went to war and you came home and you were part of the great generation that came back and could participate in the GI Bill, you did not get access to the kinds of loans and other folks to move into any neighborhood you wanted because you were redlined. And so I don't think that it's very debatable, in my opinion, if you care to know all of the facts and all of our history in its full glory, that African Americans who were part of the great diaspora after slavery were sent out and basically were forced to leave their homes and give up everything they have. And as a consequence, they have not been able to build back generational wealth, and therefore don't have the same access to opportunities that the rest of us have. When I was in Louisville, Kentucky, a young junior high school student, African-American girl, said to me, Mr. Mayor, she said, out here, it's really clear to us that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And she is exactly correct. And so now we find ourselves in this cataclysmic moment where young people, white and black, are basically stopping everything in the country and marching, mostly peacefully and loudly and aggressively as they should, exercising their constitutional rights as true patriots are obligated to do, and basically telling us that we need to get it better. And as we think about building our country back, that we don't want to go back to normal. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. I found this to be universally true, that if you're in a situation and you're hurt by a traumatic event, someone in your family is sick with cancer, a tornado hits your house, a hurricane comes, something, you have COVID, all you're thinking about is getting back to what it was like before that thing happened. In other words, just put it back. We'll act like we didn't see it, didn't hear it, didn't know it, and we can just move on. Just build it back like it was. Make it normal. When you say those words to an African-American says, hell no, I don't want it to be normal because my normal was not good. We saw this same feeling after Katrina when New Orleans got beat to death. We lost 1,800 people, 250,000 homes got hurt. The idea was, that you put the city back just like it was? No. Why don't we build it the way it should have been had we gotten it right the first time, which made us really look deep into who are we? What do we want to be? What community do we want to live in? What do we want the future to look like? And we were forced to reconcile racially, economically, that the city wasn't working for everybody. And that if we were going to build it back through an equity lens, through our small businesses, through our schools, through our hospitals, through our criminal justice system, that we had to do something very different. And I think this country is in that moment as we speak. We have to now think about the COVID virus and the very interesting dichotomy that it clearly did not discriminate in who it touched, but it certainly impacted people disproportionately based on where they found them. The number of people that are African-American and the number of people that are dying, it's disproportionate, it doesn't work. You'll see the same thing with business closings. You'll see the same thing with the distribution of the federal money. You will see it all because catastrophic events put a lens on the fissures in society that already exist. It puts a magnifying glass on it. It makes what was beautiful much more beautiful and much more vivid and much more appreciated, but it does the same thing with all the bad stuff that we have. And of course, race is one of them. Now, I have to say this. I don't really think that many sides to this story. I think there are two. I think you can go one way and continue to support institutions that over time, sometimes benignly and intentionally, sometimes intentionally, have basically treated African Americans as second-class citizens. And that is exactly what has happened in our country. Although we have mightily tried to get past that, we have not yet succeeded. Or you can say, you know what? It's time to buckle down and to really fulfill this country's aspiration, the one that we spoke of very early, the one that our founding fathers set for us. E Pluribus Unum, out of many we are one. We hold these truths to be self-evident, et cetera, et cetera. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the word indivisible. All of those things are things that we promise to each other, but it is absolutely clear from the murder that we saw last week that some people are treated differently from others in similar situations. And that is an example that all of us need to take to heart and promise that we are going to do something about and fix, starting with reforming the criminal justice system so that it's fair and just, taking it to our banking system, our economic system, taking it to the development of small businesses, taking it into how cities are run, that entire thing. Because at the end of the day, I can assure you of this. I just believe this to be true. Unless and until America deals with the issue of race, unless and until we lift up every human being, that is every human being in the country, and give them the opportunity to reach their God-given potential, to seek opportunities they could, we are the ones who are going to suffer. This is not, to be clear, just a quote unquote black problem. Clearly not the one that needs to be solved, because it is white people mostly that hold the presidency, that hold the Senate, that hold the Congress, that hold all of the C-suites by large, that start most of the small businesses and that control most of the wealth in this country. And so that is why, I heard you say this a little bit earlier, some of your African-American friends are admonishing us who profess to want to listen and to want to hear that this is really something for us to do, not them. It's not their responsibility. And it's not just their problem. It's our responsibility, and it's clearly all of our problems. And so I know this is not an easy subject for you. It's okay when you're trying to talk about this with your friends that you get tongue-tied. You don't necessarily know what questions to ask, but what's most important is that you take a step in that direction. In my opinion, what is required is that the country has got to look back and say that what we did in this country with slavery was wrong, that it had consequences that still exist today, that laws that were passed after slavery, from Jim Crow all the way through redlining, all the way through the things that I've told you, continue to impact us because African Americans weren't able to build generational wealth, and that we recognize as a country that if every citizen is not able to go forward, then none of us are. That's the first thing that has to happen. Unless and until we do that, the African American community is justified in saying it's hard for us to have a reconciliation. Then after that happens, we have to commit to doing better. And then we have to think collectively what better looks like. But better, as hard as it is to get there, in my mind, is fairly simple. If you believe that everybody comes to the table of democracy as equals, and that every human value, every human being has equal value. If we could start there and then hold ourselves and the things that we do and the institutions that we create and the decisions that we make to those principles, there's no reason to believe that this country cannot start winning the century like we should be doing right now. But this is not going to be easy. It will not end when the protest ends, because the deep dives have to take place, not just in the White House, not just in Congress, not just in the Senate, not just in the governor's chairs. It actually has to take place in the main streets and the places where you work every day. And it actually starts with you and me and us and the relationships that we have, and building that resilience that I talked about, one block, one person, one community, one home, one church, one state at a time. It's not the president of the United States, whoever he or she may be at any particular time, because presidents will come and presidents will go, as they have since the inception of the United States of America, and we still haven't gotten this right. So this is on us. I just commend it to you. I think it's critically important, because unless we get this right, it will always make us weaker. And when we are confronted with things that we cannot control, that will certainly come our way, because so many of them have, and they always will, we will never be in a strong position to save each other, to lift each other up, and to get back to where we wanted to be if we don't do that. So thank you very much. I've talked enough. I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you might have.
No, that was a great message.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mayor Landrieu.
Sure.
You know,
I have no questions.
You've called race America's most traumatic issue, and I think that is a little bit of where the discomfort is in having these conversations. We heard this morning, from some of our African American members of our community that, to reflect what you just said, that white Americans need to have conversations with each other about race. It's not just about having conversations across races about race. How would you encourage us to facilitate those? Where would you encourage us to start? Obviously this is an effort in that direction. We heard this morning from members of our community that one of the members of our community said, start with yourself, have the conversation with yourself, and then have the conversation with your family, and then your community, and work outwards from there. I'm curious about your response to that, and you've made this the focus of your foundation and your life's work. So help us to think about how to have that conversation.
Well, that was good advice that your friend gave. I think all of us should start with ourselves. I mean, it's important to say, do I have any blind spots? Do I not see things that I should see? Like, I walk by the Confederate monuments every day, and they never bothered me until my friend Wynton Marsalis smacked me on the head and said, hey, do you know what that is? So, even somebody like me I grew up in a mixed neighborhood and thought that I was racially sensitive. I walked by something that I didn't see and did not know that it was offending or making people like a Wynton Marsalis or a Louis Armstrong or a young African-American girl feel like you're not welcome here, which is just really kind of weird in the city of New Orleans, which prides itself on being a multicultural destination. Interestingly enough, my mother, who I think is a saint, she had 9 kids in 11 years. She's going straight to heaven, and I hope she drags me through there with her. She said to me, I read your book. I assume because you're my son and you wrote it that everything in the book is true. And I said, yeah, it is. She said, well, I didn't know all of that stuff about our history. Now my mother's smart. My mother graduated, I think, second in her class from Loyola. She had a good education, but the history that she learned was a very narrow history. It wasn't really, it wasn't true. And secondly, it wasn't robust. And thirdly, it wasn't full. So in a way of giving her the benefit of the doubt, you say, well, okay, gee, Mom, if you didn't know, well, the book can help explain it to you, or there's a lot of other research that you can think about. But if your mind is open and if you're intellectually curious, then educate yourself about it. And then think about how you have acted in your life and ask whether or not there's anything you have done or can do to make it better. So that's a great place to start. Another place that's a little bit harder is when you get around other people who look just like you. Let me give you 2 places. Let's just say you're in the locker room at the country club that doesn't let African Americans in. Let's just say you're at the hairstylist and there are a lot of, folks, mostly ladies in this instance, around, and somebody's talking out of school, and you're surrounded by only white people, but you live in a city that's 65% African American. Do you think you might say, well, this feels strange? How come there are only white people in this place? Why would that be? Is it because African Americans just chose not to come here? Do they not feel comfortable? Oh, wait, there's a covenant in the country club that doesn't allow people of color to be here. Oh, yes, no, we have one. But you see, you have to be a particular kind of person. So that, weirdly enough, in a city, New Orleans, 65% African American, there are a couple of clubs here that don't let African American people in, or if they do, they have to be the president of the bank. I mean, it's got to be like the best of the best. So you might ask yourself, well, do I feel comfortable here? Is this where I want to spend my time? Are my children learning what it is that I need to learn? Another place you might think about it is when you go to the office and you look around and you say, wow, all these seminars that I go to, all the people look just like me. Ask yourself why. And then say, well, gee, all of us need access to capital. Yeah, that's true. But if you go talk to Stephen Case and you go talk to a whole bunch of people about how you distribute capital and who's got all of the funds and where they bring them, the first thing you know is that they've kind of sequestered on the West Coast, and on the East Coast. But when they do come to the South, do they go to the communities of color? Entrepreneurs, is there a special program, for that? So when you start like opening up and then you go, oh my God, I've been doing this every day. How come I didn't notice that? Well, because you didn't look. And you weren't sensitized to it, which is, no harm, no foul for the minute. Not that there's no harm, no foul, but just for the minute, because I'm not trying to find fault. I'm trying to get people to think about responsibility, because when you start putting your finger in people's faces and say you're at fault, they shut down. You could have a conversation about what white privilege is, and hope your friends don't catch their hair on fire by saying, I absolutely do not, benefit from white privilege. Well, you try to talk to them in a different way. I was in Tallulah in the Delta, and we had a meeting, and I walked out and there was a woman, I'm going to say she was around my age. She was a very nice white woman, very nicely dressed. She had a beautiful blouse on and a coat, and she had pearls and white pants on and really nice shoes. And we were standing outside of the courthouse next to the river, because the white people lived on one side of the river and the black people lived on the other side of the river. And I said to her on purpose, because I wanted to provoke this discussion, and I wanted to see how she responded. I said, do you think that you benefit from white privilege? She was very offended. She said, I absolutely do not. I have earned everything that I have done in my life. And I said, well, I'm sure you have. You look like a very smart, competent person. I said, but can I tell you a story and then ask you what you think? She said, absolutely. And I said, you got any kids? She goes, oh yeah, I have a teenage son. I said, does he act right all the time? He said, no. I said, so you and your husband, if y'all went out to dinner one night and your son decided to have a party and have some friends over without telling you, and they were smoking weed, not that your son would smoke weed, but if they were, what would happen if the police came? And she said, Irving, the name of the chief of police, would call me. And I said, what would he do? She said, he would tell me to come get my son. And then what would he tell your son? He would say, son, now your mom is going to deal with you. Isn't that right? And in most of our lives, if you're a white kid, that's what happens. Okay. Now let me tell you what never happens in an African-American community. So I asked her and I said, where do the African-American community live? She said, across the river, across the track, across the lake. I said, great. And if that kid got in trouble, what would they do? She said they would arrest him and they would not call the parents the way they called me because they don't know him. I said, that's exactly right. I said, so in that instance, just on a very human level, can you see how the police officer, because he knows you and because he trusts you, he gave you and your son the benefit of the doubt, how the law gave you the benefit of the doubt. She said, oh, of course. I said, well, that's what privilege is. Oh, she goes, oh, why didn't you say so? Right? So those are the kind of conversations that you can have with each other, because white people get, that I have talked to that are challenged, like all of us, they get real defensive about this, like they're being blamed for slavery. Nobody's blaming you for slavery, but you can take some level of responsibility and fault for not understanding what it was, how it happened, and how those laws, many of them are still in effect. And one final thought on this, because white people try to escape on this. Hey man, don't talk to me about that. That was a long time ago. I don't know anybody. I'm not connected to it. I'm not touching that. This is the God's truth. My father, who many of you know, was served as mayor of the city from 70 to 78. He's 30 years older than me. He was born in 1930. All right. I was born in 1960. My father, who's right down the street, who I could go sit on his porch if it wasn't for COVID and hug him and kiss him and touch him right now. His hands touched his great-great-grandmother who lived during slavery. So, you know, when you say, well, it was that long ago, I didn't know anybody, well, you know what? You ought to think about that, especially if you live in the South, and especially if your family could be from a rural area. It is highly likely that you are directly connected to that event. And it is the worst thing that this country has ever done. And you probably know generations of people that have come from that very, very life who have not had the same opportunities that you have had. So then you say to yourself, well, how can I fix that? And then you do it. That's a way that you start with yourself. The second way is then to say, well, okay, if I understand this, I really am going to be aware and notice what the legislature's doing, what the city council's doing, what the federal government is doing around the things that matter, and give credence to my friends from the NAACP, from the Urban League when Mark Morial comes on, because they have very specific things that they have asked for that we could know about if we just took the time to read them and to understand them and just didn't dismiss them because they came from a quote unquote Black organization. They're not radical. They're just very fundamental to the American way of being. And if you do all of those things, I just gave you about 5 years of work, but it has to start. It has got to start now. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're hearing on the streets of America. And that is the right call to action.
Yeah. And one of the things you've always said is the idea that change happens gradually and then very suddenly. And
yeah.
We're in this moment where I don't think 3 months ago we would have assumed we could actually make Americans stay in their homes and not go down the street to hug their father or to share a beer. And we've been able to do that in response to this. And now it feels like we've started to build a muscle for change. And do you feel like this is time for Americans to step up on this issue because of what we're sort of facing?
Let me answer the last question first. It has to be the moment. All right. However, change comes hard to people, man. Change comes hard. People don't like to change. It doesn't come to us naturally. It scares us. The status quo, possession is 9/10 of the law. Even after Katrina, when we got beat to death, everybody knew that the schools were broken down and we needed to build new schools. Some folks that went to schools that were broken down just didn't want a new building because that was you changing kind of the school that you went to, because you're so connected to it. Mm-hmm. And so it occurred to me when I was trying to help rebuild the city with all of the citizens, that change was much harder than it had to be, just on general stuff. And man, when it comes to race, let me just tell you, I mean, we are deeply embedded in this notion in a way that we do not understand about ourselves. We just don't understand it. And it's going to require a really, really, really deep, thoughtful, insightful inner look about that. So that's the second thing. The third thing is this. I do think, ironically, just because of the way we're wired as human beings, that we get dragged a little bit, we pull back, we get dragged a little bit, then something cataclysmic happens. And then we're faced with a choice, because you can't turn away. I mean, you cannot turn away from George Floyd, can you? Can you not right now see the knee on his neck and asking yourself, why is the cop doing that? Oh, wait, why does he have his hands in his pocket? Oh, wait, why is that guy standing there again? Oh, wait, it was for a $20 bill that he counterfeited allegedly during the corona frickin' virus? Are you kidding me? Like, why? Like, every thoughtful person in America had that same thing. African Americans had that same thing and thought, you have got to be frickin' kidding me, that how obvious this is, and nobody's moving him. And by the way, that looks like me down there. And why do you let this happen if you're my friend? Why do y'all, us, since we control everything, why do y'all keep letting this happen? We have to answer that question, because the question now has been called, because you see it and you can't turn away from it. And oh, by the way, notwithstanding the fact that it was a really personal incident, it was also symbolic of all of the other stuff that can be seen right through that lens. And so my question to America is, how do you look away from that? How do you just go back to, oh, let's just prosecute the cops and make sure, that justice is done right there, but not look at the patterns and practices, right? Not look at the training of that department. That's what we did in NOPD. For 8 years, the city were under a federal consent decree, which required us to completely rebuild our department, that dealt with exactly how to train police officers to protect and to serve, who, by the way, we have great admiration for. And it turns out that you can actually hire really good people and train them well and supervise them and have something called the early warning system, which is a system that's designed to give you notice and information if a particular person who's a police officer does not de-escalate the way that they're supposed to handle crowds. You can go, okay, well, wait a minute, that person needs some remediation, or they don't need to be on the force. We have something called EPIC training in New Orleans that actually encourages police officers to help another police officer make good decision in real time. And if they're not, to make a decision for them and be honored for it, rather than to be harangued out of the department because you don't live behind the cloak of secrecy. We have use of force training that says, look, you can't ever use force unless you absolutely have to. It used to be use force first, we'll talk later. We have a policy now that has body cameras. Now, the police officers didn't want these to begin with, but now most of our officers in New Orleans are very thankful for body cameras. And one of the reasons is because in the incidences, when they are justified in their actions, it's on film. But here's the problem: when they're not, it's on film as well. So it encourages them and incents them to do that. So there are lots of different, very specific things that departments can do to be better. We in the city of New Orleans have gone through that, and our department is acting very professionally right now. And so, that's just there. And so if there was institutional bias in police departments, and then you said, well, okay, let's go look at the banking institutions. Mm-hmm. Who gets the money? Who doesn't get the money? What community do they live in? Who's getting the loans, et cetera? Same thing with housing. Same thing with, call it anything, baseball, basketball, football. You will find these barriers in place that African Americans for years have said, hey man, this is a problem for me. And we didn't hear, because we didn't want to, because we thought it didn't have anything to do with us. Well, it turns out that it does. And we're the ones, as well as them, clearly, that will pay a price if we don't get it right.
Right. That's right.
I think it's interesting today more than ever, or at least we're seeing a light shone on it, is the mayor across the country is actually filling a huge leadership void. And is playing a big role in terms of how we lead and how we actually shift this issue. It's also a time then when there are also missteps being made. And so do you have any sort of, now you're out of office, do you have any advice for your fellow mayors on on where to lead, what to do during this time?
Well, unfortunately, I'm one of 9 kids, so I always have an opinion about something, and I'm happy to give it. I had the great pleasure of serving as the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which is the association that most mayors with cities of 30,000 or more belong to. And by the way, Mark Morial did too before me, so he knows more about this than I do. I have always thought, although I have a great reverence for the presidency and the Senate and Congress, and really believe that a federal government that's working well, rightly ordered, focused, and moving in the right direction can be a great partner with the private sector and the not-for-profit sector to do great stuff. That most of this stuff happens actually on a much, much lower level. And not to be disrespectful to governors, many of you know I served as lieutenant governor for 6 years. That's still a little bit high to get down to the meats and potatoes of what happens on the ground. That usually happens on a citizen level. Look, this is just anecdotal, but when I was lieutenant governor and I was working with Governor Blanco and we did something, it had to go through the legislature, then it had to go through the Administrative Procedures Act, and 6 months later it became law, and then it wound its way down to having some level of impact. When I was the mayor, when I made a decision, it hit the ground the next day. And the way you knew what people thought about it is when you went to the store to get milk in the morning or stuff to feed your kids, or you went to the cleaners, or you went to the gas station to fill your car up, from the folks who said, man, I can't believe you did that, or you either got a pat on the butt or you got a slap on the head, and you hear it right away. So there's a reverberation immediately, and it creates a dynamism that doesn't exist on the state and national level. And so mayors, in the last, it was this way when my dad was mayor, and then it stopped for a little while, then it got that way again. They are really the laboratories of innovation and change. Yeah. Now, they don't have the same kind of resources that the federal government does and the state does. So they have to find partnerships with the private sector and with entrepreneurs and with the faith-based community to try to create a sense of vibrancy. So the leadership, whether it's in the presidency or the governor's offices, the mayor, really, really matters. The tone that's set, your willingness to be open, your willingness to bring people in is critically important. And it doesn't manifest itself anytime more clearly than when you're in a catastrophic event. And so you can see right now which governors and which mayors are actually up to the task of responding to a really bad event. Now, if you're prepared, if you're organized, if you have really good people around you, if you have gamed it out and practiced, and you understand who you work for and what your mission is, where there's clear command and control, coordination, communication, you will have a good response. If you don't have that stuff, you're not going to have a good response. Or if your mind is altered in a way that doesn't allow you to understand it, that's essentially, I'll make this one political statement, what we're seeing in our president. He is not wired right to respond to this moment. Forget about the politics of it. Just forget about it. And I say that because on this day, this is Thursday, I think, we have had this week Republican presidents, past presidents, and Republican generals, et cetera, conservatives come out and say, look, this is an existential moment. This isn't about party. It's not about re-election. It's about leadership. You have to be wired the right way. Put philosophy just aside for a minute, because you can. There can be leaders who argue about whether there should be tax cuts and not tax cuts, or whether infrastructure is better than, something else. But when you have a catastrophic event like this, a traumatic event, like any one of these three things that we're going through, that is when the nation has to come together and say, listen, I'm going to put aside my stuff. I'm going to come back and fight with you later about all that stuff that we disagree with. And you know what it is. You got to say, no, this rises above. And the truth of the matter is this economic crisis rises above. The COVID-19 crisis rises above. And of course, race has always risen above. And just to back to this point that I will make ad nauseum for the rest of my life. This is, as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said, I'm name dropping now because I was on a Zoom thing with him yesterday, and I'm pumped up that I was able to do it. I was like, hey, man, to call him Mr. Jabbar. He actually said it better than anybody. He said, racism is like dust in the air, and you really can't see it until you turn the light on. And then when you do, it's everywhere. All right. That is not to say that every human being in the world is a racist and that is mean and hateful, but it is to say that we are blind, that we don't see, we don't know. And sometimes we settle for things because we're okay, even though some people that we may not know are not, and we're not willing to fight for them. And that creates a disparate outcome that is not just and is not fair. That's what African Americans are saying to us. And I'm going to end with this because I know we have to go. My father's best friend was Norman C. Francis, Dr. Francis, who was the president of Xavier University. He was the longest serving president of an HBCU. He and my daddy grew up together. And my father got a lot of praise when he was younger about standing up for Norman and his family and a whole bunch of other stuff. And when I asked my dad why he did it, why did he do that for Norman? He said, I didn't do that for Norman. I said, well, what do you mean? Everybody gave you, a lot of pats on the back for helping Norman. He goes, well, it was helpful to Norman, but I did not do it for Norman because I did it for me. And I said, really? I said, it's interesting. I said, why do you say that? He said, well, Norman was better looking than me. He was smarter than me. He was faster than me. And he said, and I really loved being with him. And he was my very, very dear friend. And he said, so if Norman couldn't go someplace, I couldn't go someplace. And if I couldn't go someplace, he goes, I'm the one that lost. Norman lost. It was offensive and it was unjust. He goes, but actually I was defending myself from a crazy rule that says Norman can't go through this door. Well, all of a sudden I can't be with Norman and I can't get what he has to give me. That's a very interesting thing for us white people to think about. As we took 4 million African Americans and sent them away, and they took their raw talent, their intellectual capital, all of their raw material, all of their wealth out of the South, and went to Los Angeles and taught them how to make gumbo, and went to New York and taught them how to make jazz like Wynton, or went all around the world and teach them beautiful music like Louis Armstrong, or took all of our artists and our intellectuals. Who do you think lost the value of all of that talent and the joy, much less the relationships that never were? Who really lost in that regard? I mean, I think all of us did. And so I don't need to really go get an economist to tell you that if we had more people who had the opportunity to create great stuff, that we would all be better because the economy would be exponentially higher. And so if more people were healthy and more people had good educations and more people did not have a disparate impact from the criminal justice system and spend time in jail when they shouldn't be there, and those individuals had the opportunities to financial access that we have, and they were doing the kind of things that really smart, wonderful, capable people do when they're given opportunity, I think we'll all be a little bit richer, don't you think? I mean, both physically, spiritually, and financially. So to me, it's kind of a no-brainer. And I'm just kind of at a point in my life now where I just need to kind of get white people to kind of, say, pay attention. I didn't understand. It's okay. But you know what? We know now. And so now you know. So now what you going to do?
That's right.
I think that's a great way to end.
Yeah. Well, Mayor Landrieu, thank you very much for joining us today. You mentioned your book. I want to share it with the audience here, In the Shadows of Statues. Very interesting to have you on. On today of all days, including where in Richmond the statues are going to be removed, and in some ways part thanks to your leadership in New Orleans. Anyway, thank you. Big thank you to Scott Shallett for
good job, Scott,
helping us to get you on today.
You're the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar of our.
I was so excited to meet him. I didn't feel worthy. I was like, Mr. Jabbar, I don't know how I got on this thing with you, but it's nice to meet you. He was great, by the way. A lot of fun.
We feel the same way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate it, you guys.
We do too. Thanks very much.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.